Hello and welcome to another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Jamie Johnson, the legal and government correspondent, and with me today I have two guests representing the School District of Hudson. We have Superintendent Mary Bowen Eggebraaten.
Hello, Jamie.
And Barb Van Loenen, who is the school board president.
Hi, Jamie.
Welcome to the show. Good to have you on. You both have been guests before on the previous show that we had, I guess. And over the time we've talked about the Learning 2020, that project, and various space needs, and now we're entering another time period where the school board has approved for a referendum the purchase of some property within the city limits of Hudson. Is that correct?
Correct.
All right, so first of all, what is it that's being proposed to be purchased?
So the referendum is for the voters to decide whether or not they will approve the purchase of the property commonly known as St. Croix Meadows or the dog track, which for people that are familiar with Hudson, that is the property that has been vacant for a number of years just down Carmichael right before it turns into County Road F.
And it's been several years, I don't know, at least 10 anyway,
About 10.
When there was actually a dog track being operated there.
Correct.
And how much is this referendum issue?
Yes, so the purchase price would be $8.25 million for what is roughly 126 acres of land and the existing structures that are on that property.
Okay, and so what is the need for putting on a referendum as opposed to the school board not just going out and purchasing it?
Legally, we are obligated to have the voters decide whether or not we will purchase that property.
And, well, I recall an earlier purchase by the school district, that was the land out on UU. That was not put to a referendum, or was it?
It was. It was.
Okay.
We purchased in the 50s 23 acres, and then we added on in 2001, making a total of about 110 acres on that site.
Okay. Will this have an impact on the tax levy if the purchase is approved by the voters?
It will. As we've looked at the numbers at $8.25 million, it adds about 9 cents per thousand.
Okay, I think we have a graphic that we'll put up for our viewers, and I'll just have it in front of us here. And so this is a projection of what current levels are, and we have a number on the left side of this graphic, and it's in the millions. What does that represent?
That represents the annual debt service payments by the school district for previous referendums.
Okay, and then below is, the numbers are kind of squished together, but those each bar represents a year.
Yes, that is correct.
And so this is projected out by 20 years, and I see a decrease is, whether this referendum were approved or not, this is going to decrease over time.
That is correct, yes.
But the lighter gray on top of, and this was my printing off my machine, which was not color coded. So do you recall
I think it was the current debt is blue, I believe, and the additional debt that we would incur if with the passage of the referendum is green.
Okay, thanks for explaining the colors. I just had this printed off in black and white, so I wasn't sure what the colors were. But basically that additional amount then would be what would be needed to service the purchase price.
Correct.
And then we have a box in the upper right corner as to the estimated tax impact, and then you've got 3 examples. If your property is currently has an assessed value of $150,000, then it would have an annual impact of $13.50.
That is correct, Jamie.
Okay. Now, these relate to just the purchase of the land, and we're going to get into why are we talking about land only and not a building, because I'm assuming that this land is being purchased to put a building on eventually.
It is.
It is.
Well, but there is a building on there now, and we would try to use part of that.
Certainly, we have just had an assessment done of that particular property, and 90,000 square feet, or about 2/3 of that property, will be able to use for a secondary school.
Okay. For those people that might be viewing, don't know the history, I mean, we've had a proposal for building an additional secondary school that was, what, 7, 8 years ago?
It was presented by the Facilities Task Force in December, I believe, of 2004.
Okay, so it's going on 8 years now. Okay. Now, and so there was perceived to be a need for additional secondary school space then. We have to ask one, this is only the next referendum since then that has proposed some type of solution for secondary space?
Well, the first referendum was for Rivercrest, following the Facilities Task Force. That was part of their recommendation.
But that you're talking about the elementary school?
Yes,
Okay.
was for an elementary school.
All right.
And the board's intent, right after that opened, was to move towards the secondary solution. That happened to be 2008, and we all know what happened in 2008. The recession occurred. It was a district goal, and the board chose to put that on hold in consideration for our taxpayers at that time.
Okay. Well, let's look at what's happened in the meantime then to space needs. If it was determined 8 years ago that it was anticipated we'd need additional secondary space, and a referendum was put up for an 8-9 building that did not get approved, that enrollment, has it gone up as much as expected, more than expected, or where are we at on projections for enrollment?
Mary can correct me if I'm wrong, but my recollection is the enrollment projections are, as we look at our student count today, are relatively close to the projections that we had looked at prior. So our student body has obviously grown, and the need is at a point now where it is really essential that the community support a referendum so that we can move forward with some sort of space for the secondary student population.
And for those viewers, we know that the two schools that we have currently, the high school is how old?
It's about 48 years, the older section of the high school. So almost 50 years old.
And there's been referendums over the time that they built an auditorium and connected the two sides.
Correct.
This junior high was taken out of there, and they created the middle school over on, which is right off of Carmichael.
Correct.
And let's take the middle school first. So on that graphic, and again, I don't have the colors, but we've got a lighter number that's above the darker number below. And we have, so these are birth rates and then projected enrollment. Is that correct?
Well, the graphic itself comes from Dr. Hazel Reinhardt's projections of growth over this period of time. So she gave us a low number and a high number. So you'll see that in the two lines that go through the number of years. And at one point there is, and I can't see the year exactly, but there is a downturn, and people have asked us about that downturn in the numbers.
Okay.
And what's happened there is those are the years 2008, 2009 during the recession. And at that time, the birth rates in our county were down slightly. And as a result, what's off that chart, and Dr. Hazel Reinhardt's report talks about that, is what happens next. So if we would extend the chart one more year, we would see record birth rates coming into 6th grade in the middle school. And so it's anticipated at that time, where the arrows occur, that our enrollments would go back up.
Now, is this considering just children being born in the school district, or is this anticipating further growth and movement into the school district?
It's both.
Both.
It's
Okay.
both.
Yes.
And if we just look at our current enrollment right now, we're at 169 students over capacity.
Well, let's explain this graph a little more, because I see when you say capacity, there's a number here that's between 1,100 and 1,150, and it's a constant line across the bottom of the graph.
1125.
And that references then the capacity
Of the
that you
current
have
structure.
of the middle school.
Correct.
Now, does that reflect how many lockers there are at the middle school then, or?
There's probably more lockers than that, because we've continued to add lockers each year. But it
we're talking-
represents the number of students based on our class size guidelines and the number of
Classrooms.
classrooms that we have, and the middle school program, and how many students we can serve at almost 100% in that building.
So we're talking this first year on the graph is 2011, 2012, the current year we're in. We're at 1,300 roughly?
A little less than 1,300, but just a few students less. Mhm.
Okay. So as you said, about 170 over capacity. This
Correct.
1294 is the figure over on the right-hand
Yes.
side of the graph, so that tells our viewers where we're at currently. And then where you go from there are projections based on the children that are in the next grade, the 5th grades and the 4th grades and so forth.
Plus
Correct.
students that are anticipated to move into the district, yes. It's the total growth anticipated.
And so when you had said earlier, Mary, that if the chart were extended, we see a decline for those 2 years of the recession.
Which is reflects the birth rates of the recession and students entering the middle school at that time.
And then what we'll see is likely a sharp increase that would reflect these record birth rates, unless we had a mass movement of the children that are currently now 2 years old and their families moved out of the district. That would be, otherwise, we're going to basically see a resumption of that upward trend.
That's what we would expect to see, yes.
Okay. And so what are you doing now if you're almost 170 students over capacity? What are you doing now to facilitate
Well, we're
that?
using 3 additional classrooms all day in Hudson Prairie, so decreasing their capacity in that building for our health classes. We also have 14 teachers who are in carts, so every hour they move to a classroom that is open during that time period. That's really significant into our program. You know, the middle school is a house structure, and essentially it's a community where the students are well known by a series of teachers. They are math, science, language arts, reading, and social studies teachers who they have all day, and they're with the same group of students. And as a result of that, we're taking some of those students out of that house to the teachers on carts and moving them someplace else in the building. The middle school program and that kind of design has been designed specifically to support students of our middle school age. And that concept is eroding because of these additional teachers who are not part of the house, don't know the students as well, and have a different group of students every hour.
Okay, just looking at these projections then for the children that were born, let's say in 2009, they would be 10 years old, and in the year 2018, 2019, I guess that would be 2008, just before the recession. 2007, they would be entering middle school, and we'll be at a projected enrollment of about 1550. Is that
On the
correct?
low end of the range of the estimate, and then as high as over 1,600 on the high end of that range.
So we'll be at roughly 30% over capacity. So it's designed to be a 3-year school, and we'll be one of those grades, almost a complete grade over capacity. It kind of has to ask the question now. I know neither of you were in your current positions when that building was built, but why did they build a building so recently? I mean, that middle school was built what year?
20 years ago, 1992.
The current middle school
Correct.
was 1992. Correct. But yet it's been over that 1,125 capacity for a couple years now, correct?
Yes.
It has.
For several years. But why wasn't it built to accommodate projections that would have accommodated all 3 grades out for a few more years?
Yeah.
Jamie, we have the largest middle school in the state of Wisconsin for grades 6th, 7th, and 8th in one place. And most middle schools, large middle schools, are about 600 to 700 students. We almost right now have a school with 2 middle schools in the school. The school itself was designed very well to accommodate a large number of students, but when we look at how far out demographers are comfortable projecting, it's 10 years. So as a result, they didn't know how many students were actually going to be in that middle school. And again, if you look at that site with Hudson Prairie, there are about 1,800 students in one site.
You're talking about
K
Hudson
through
Prairie
8.
as an elementary school.
Correct. So K through 8 on that one site, there's 1,800 students at the present time.
Okay. Well, that's the middle school. So we have an obvious problem that has been going on. Now, the high school is a little closer. They've done some things at the high school with expanding over the years. You said it's an older facility, about 50 years old, where it actually at one time had grades 7 through 12, as I understand it. It was before my time. of
2
coming to
different
Hudson.
structures, but yes.
And now it's been combined and tried to increase it, but there's limits on the current high school as well as far as internally having children that have gone to school there. My kids are all graduated now, but I've lectured at the high school and I've had events there and understand what it's like when the bell rings and how crowded the hallways are, the fact that the cafeteria is in 3 shifts now. if we look at that graphic for high school projections, now we have a capacity, again, your capacity.
1,680 students.
Okay, and enrollment actual is 1635. So we're within about 45 students of capacity.
Right.
And to give folks some kind of guide as far as the last several years, the annual increases, except when a smaller class comes through the bubble, so to speak, the annual increases tend to be in that 45 range, 40 to 60?
Well, the high school for a number of years has been pretty stable in their population. But as we look at the elementary, that has been increasing over time, those students moving to the middle school and then moving to the high school, we're expecting growth next year. It should reach capacity by Dr. Reinhardt's projections.
And then again, now these projections go out to 2021. And the reason that they don't have the drop off that the middle school did is because those middle school kids won't be in
Correct.
the high school yet.
Yes.
Correct.
And for those 2-year period of a lower birth rate during the recession, we'll see a slight downturn for out into the 2020 decade somewhere for a couple years, but then a resumption then of the continued growth.
That's what we anticipate.
Okay. So that's what we see as a growing need for more space.
Just to add to that, if we would take our students who are currently in the appropriate grades and move them forward into the high school for the next 4 years, and we would add just half of the parochial students in those same grades into our high school, we would have over 1,800 students. And that's without people moving into our community. That's the students that are in our schools right now. So 1,800 in a building of capacity of 1,680. And we should talk a little bit about the capacity. That reflects seats in classrooms. We have the issue of our common areas, like the halls, the cafeteria, the media center. Those areas are lacking in space. They were never built to accommodate the size we currently have, the number of students that we currently have within our buildings. So we have a limited capacity. Yes, we have seats in classrooms, but the rest of the school that serves our students as well was not built to accommodate the students we have now.
Well, and to give also some more historical perspective is that the capacity of the high school was lower just a few years ago.
Yes.
And I say a few years ago, but I know time passes fast. But you actually had the administration, your office was in that building.
It was, and we moved out and we added to the capacity.
Okay,
with
how
that.
much was added roughly?
I believe it was about 150 seats.
Okay, that was my recollection, it was in that ballpark, but I didn't want to necessarily say a number. But so the administration building was purchased, and that was done at in order to address the shorter term need for space in the high school.
That is correct, yes.
I know that there was talk about building temporaries at one time, and that was kind of the alternative. If we didn't purchase an administration building, we were going to have to set up the mobile homes or what.
We were going to have to do something,
Right.
so that was considered.
Okay. So the school, just considering these different options, is now proposing to purchase the former dog track that has been vacant for several years. Why do we need to make another purchase if there's land that was purchased in 2002, you said, that was added on?
2001 was
2001,
the
all right.
large portion of that.
Right, out on UU, that was specifically purchased for future needs, knowing that secondary school space was going to be needed. Why don't we just use what we have instead of sending to the voters another purchase item?
So the UU property, and people that have watched the school board meetings will have heard some of this, but there really are two primary reasons the UU property does not work for a secondary school, really of any size. And those two reasons are, one, it's not in the city and it doesn't have city water and sewer, and given what we understand about the state regulations, in order to house a population on that site that is of the size that we would talk about with the secondary school, we would actually have to build our own wastewater treatment facility on that property to service the students and faculty that would be on that property. Not only an expensive proposition, but perhaps a less desirable situation. The second reason, and equally as important, is if you're familiar with that property, it has very severe grade changes on it. So it's very hilly in spots, and then it has steep drop-offs making it very difficult to find a place on the property where you could actually site a building without doing really significant site grading or site preparation work.
And when you say the property, you're referring to the more recent purchase part of this?
Both of them, frankly.
Both of them together.
Okay.
And I just add to what Barb talked about, this wastewater treatment facility, we've been told by engineers we can't even build that on this site and meet the regulations that we would need to meet with the size of school we're talking about. So really we can't
Okay, now let's talk about that, the size of school you're talking about. And what is that? Because at one time, the 8-9 building was on the referendum, and I presume that it was being proposed to be built at this UU site, because that's the only land where an 8-9 building could have been built.
Right.
So were the engineers that had proposed this and the school board that was in place at that time that proposed building an 8-9 building on that site wrong that they could do that?
Well, I wasn't here during that time period, but what I can tell you is the projections that started out in 2001 are different than the projections that we have today. And again, I've talked about demographers looking at 10 years out. So at that time, we've had 28% growth since 2000. We've had a 55% increase in our kindergarten. Nobody anticipated that, and now we're looking 10 years more, and we're looking at more growth.
Okay, so what was anticipated when they were proposing an 8-9 building on the UU property? Well, first they had to purchase the UU property in 2001, and I presume that somebody was telling them that they could build school buildings on it, otherwise they wouldn't.
Certainly, certainly.
Okay, and then secondly, then 3 years later, a referendum to put a school on that property was going to cost X amount of dollars, and I'm assuming included in that cost was either A, running sewer and water out to the site, or B, building this wastewater facility that you talk about. So what has changed since 2004 other than these projections? Because can a school be built there, and if so, what's the capacity of such a school?
It certainly would be a smaller school than we're talking about. We're looking at a school that can build up to the capacity of 2,000 or 2,500 students.
And that would be needed for a 4-year high school, correct?
Yes, up to the 2,500. Or that we would build an 8-9 that's expandable to that size at some time in the future. So we need the flexibility to be able to increase whatever that building is and the number of students that it serves over time.
Okay, so now you're jumping ahead a little bit, because I know that's all right, because that really is where I wanted to spend the majority of the time, is comparing, because folks want to know, one, is this purchase of the dog track just going to be another buy and hold transaction where you're buying land and holding it, and maybe the school district's in the real estate business, because that seems to have been what's happened at UU, all right? I'm not saying that that's the case, but that's what some people are saying it appears to have been. Mm-hmm. And then one, is it just a buy and hold proposition, or two, do you have a plan in mind for this new property? Maybe they're separate issues, but I want to be able to get it to the point where we're comparing as much apples to apples. And in order to get that UU property to a position where a building can be on it, we need to know what would be the capacity of that building, and how much would be the additional cost of either A, running water and sewer out there, or B, a wastewater facility. Do you know the answers to those?
So sounds like a lot of questions in there, Jamie. I'm going to advocate that maybe we break them up.
Right.
So let's talk about, I'm sorry, I lost my whole train of thought.
Well, let's just go back just a little bit. Let's add a little bit more about 2001 and the 8-9 referendum.
Okay.
There was, we believe, understanding at that time that the city of Hudson would move annex to the site, the UU site. And that was an assumption that I'm sure the Board of Education...
I remember discussions, because I live in between the city and this location.
It seemed like a reasonable
Growth
thing to
plan.
believe would happen, right, with the growth that was happening at that time.
Okay.
Absolutely. That hasn't happened. Now, you know, as we fast forward to 2012, we see that hasn't happened. So the city itself has I don't know if it's code, regulation, and the state has a regulation that annexing something needs to be adjacent to that the
Oh,
city
so you can't go
property.
out and create an island?
You can't create an island.
Okay. And
So that's the situation we're in currently. And when I came in 2005, we met with the city, and I'm not sure if it was 2005 or 2006, about their plans to possibly annex all the way to the UU site. And that just wasn't in the plan.
okay, so absent annexation, that doesn't stop schools from being built outside city limits. There's no law that says you have to build a school building in city limits, correct?
Correct.
That is correct.
Okay,
Certainly.
so then what does that do to your options for building then if it's not going to be annexed and wouldn't be city sewer and water?
Well, so we still have the two issues that really were the reasons that the board chose to go after the St. Croix Meadows property. And those two issues, as I said before, were this idea of having to put wastewater treatment. It seemed unlikely based on conversations with the city that without annexation, we were not going to get city water and sewer out there, which puts us in a position of having to do the wastewater treatment facility on the property. And there were all kinds of complications about where to site the building and the setback for the wastewater treatment plant. And then the grade changes. It's just not an ideal space for a large building.
Well, my dad used to operate a backhoe, and that's what he did for a living. And I know that that is a lot of heavy equipment operating out on that site. But again, any estimates given as to what it would take to even get a space large enough to set a building, and let alone one that might need to accommodate more secondary students than?
That would take.
We did have Hoffman come and do a rough guess several months ago. It's a 7-digit number, Jamie. So it's a very
That's
significant
just for the
expense.
excavating, let alone the installation of the wastewater?
Absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely.
So both of those are additional costs. Now, this St. Croix Meadows property would not need wastewater?
City water and sewer for a large population was already there because it operated as a dog track for a number of years.
I cut you off, I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to say, we're only talking about the construction cost of a wastewater treatment plant.
Yes.
There is also a very significant
Operating cost.
cost to operate it each year. And so that would be a tax burden that we would, that would reach out into perpetuity as long as the building was being used on that site.
Okay, if this St. Croix Meadows purchase were to be approved, what's going to happen to the UU property?
So the board would sell that property. We don't believe now is the right time. The market is still at an all-time low, but it would be in the intent to sell that property to offset the cost of the St. Croix Meadows property.
Is it the type of property you already mentioned about these significant grade changes? Is it something that is more amenable or less amenable to being used as a residential district as opposed to a business, industrial, or?
I am not a real estate expert, so I can't answer that as an expert, but my understanding is that it works much better for a single-family home type development than it would for a large single facility.
Okay. Again, what I'm trying to get us to is talking about the apples and apples, and also whether there's an option C, because what people like are choices. They don't like to be put in a box, and unfortunately, the way school referendums go, you can't have that kind of flexibility. You can't put 6 options, pick one, and then if 16 or 17% of the population want to do option F, and then go ahead and build a school based on that.
Correct.
You need to have up or down, yes or no. And so why is it, though, that you don't have a plan for the St. Croix Meadows that's being to go along with the land purchase? You've had building and facility commissions and task forces for more than a dozen years in this district. We had great recommendations that led to the 04 referendum for the 8-9 building and so forth. I understand about putting them on hold because of the recession, but why can't we just pick up where we left off, given these new projections? That's the only thing that really has changed, is the projections and the lack of annexation of land around the UU property, and just go with a plan for an 8-9 building or a plan for a 4-year school on this dog track site. Why is that not being put to the voters in April?
Okay, go ahead.
Well, you know, this is the voters' choice. And you talked about nothing has really changed. Something has significantly changed, and that is the recession and the economic conditions that we have. And as a result of that, we need our community to look at the possible solutions, and we've talked about those. An 8-9 expandable to a high school in the future if needed, a 3-year high school or a 4-year high school. Each of those have a particular cost, and there's many choices that our community is going to have to make in regard to that. Following the referendum and passage of the referendum, we'll have a 6-month community engagement process where we will have our community talk about and be involved in the choices that need to be made for the next referendum about what to build on that site. And there are different options. They each have pros and cons. Every option has things that are good about it and some downsides to it as well. And when we think about the cost, conditions have changed in our community. So what is the solution that is best for our community now and for the years ahead? That should be certainly a decision that our community makes, and we want the community to be involved in that decision.
Okay, but what's the timeline? Are we talking, this UU property was added on to, if you will, because the initial purchase was back in the 50s. Somebody with a lot of foresight, I guess, expecting the Hudson to get out that far. But 2001, we add to that purchase, quadruple the size of that property basically, and now it's 11 years later and we still don't have a building on it. So what's going to be the time frame if we purchase this dog track, former dog track? When would there be expected to be a building on that site?
I think we would anticipate the process for the community engagement discussions to begin shortly after the referendum. So we begin almost immediately to move on the decisions around what we would want to build on that site, getting that community involvement. So as quickly as we can, understanding the voting timetable, we could come back with a second referendum for the building. Whether that is the 8-9 that could someday be expanded or a high school.
So an estimation of that cost, time period, 6 months for the community engagement process.
Right.
Probably the earliest that we could come back to the community with a second referendum would be a year from April 3rd, this current referendum.
And that would be very fast, or
yes.
It could be December of 2013, which is still relatively quick when we think about what has happened historically.
And when you say come back with another referendum, are you going to come back with a multiple choice vote of whether they want to do an 8-9 building, a 3-year or a 4 years?
Unlikely.
Building?
It would be a referendum for a particular type of building with a particular cost attached to it.
Right, and it has to have a top dollar value or an estimated dollar value.
Certainly.
And to get there, you need to have contractors who put forward proposals
We
and
need to
architects
have-
draw plans,
correct.
and so that takes a little bit of time.
It
Correct.
does. And during that community engagement process, that 6 months, we hope to really identify what is the community solution to this so that we can move that forward and have the information that our community needs.
Okay, well, just identifying then again the options, because we've talked a fair amount about UU, because that's property that the school district already has. We've talked about St. Croix Meadows a little bit. I know that there's more that we can be said about the value there, and I want to talk about that. But a third option that people are suggesting and out there is property that the county already owns. It's already off the tax roll, so you're not taking property like the St. Croix Meadows, which is on the tax rolls now, and taking it off to put a school on it. But at Carmichael and Vine, we've got roughly 40 acres. Now, that is something that the county has said all along. I know they've been approached by not just the school district, but by other organizations, in fact, one that I'm a member of, to see if they would be consider selling. And there's never been a consensus of board members to say we need to dispense with that. There's been some uncertainty. I think that uncertainty, if it were to become, let's say there was a big change, short of an earthquake, but a big change would happen and they decided that they want to put it up for sale and they want to give a good deal to the school district, all right, for this 40 acres. How would that fit into the globe of these things? Obviously, it would be within the city. You'd be able to put city and water relatively inexpensively there. And you would have it in a fairly closer proximity to your already current high school and current middle school.
So here's my response to that question, and it's a very fair and valid question. The board at this point has chosen not to pursue that with the county, and there are two reasons for that. One, at the acreage they have available, it really doesn't meet our minimum criteria, and it doesn't mean that there's 63 acres, not 65. But of the acreage that is available, we would have to use some of that to create roadways and access ways. There are wetlands where neighboring areas drain into those spaces that we would have to probably create some ponding. So the acreage actually becomes much less than the 63 acres that's available.
Okay, when you say available, 63 acres is what the county owns.
Correct.
And by available meaning what they would intend to sell, but whether it's a school district or anybody that wants to use it, these ponding issues and the wetlands
would
all
still
always
be
have
there.
to be
Correct.
dealt with.
So for example, the city of Hudson has a planning document that they use, and over 6 acres of that site are reserved or required for ponding. So you start with their 63 acres, you start subtracting acreage. Off of that, the board's criteria started with 65 usable acres. That's the minimum based on the school that we're talking about, the size, the standard for a site. If we look at New
That would
Rich-
facilitate a 4-year school. I just want to
Correct.
emphasize that so we're
Absolutely.
comparing apples and apples. All right.
And if you look at the high school site at New Richmond, I believe it's close to 110 acres for a smaller school. You look at River Falls, and I've been told it's about 80 acres. So, our 65 is a minimum for the size of school that we could have on that site.
Okay, so usable acres, I had used a figure before and I pulled it out of my memory, but I might be off. I said 40 acres. Is that give or take within the ballpark of what there would be there at that site?
It certainly would be far less than the 63 that's available. Whether it's 40 or it's 45, but it's well below what our minimum threshold is. But that may not even be the biggest issue.
But you wouldn't be able to put a high school of 2,200 or 2,500 students on a site of that size.
You might not even be able to put a building that services a smaller student population than that. And part of the reason is, and for the viewers watching this, if you've ever driven on Vine or Carmichael between 6:45 and 7:15 in the morning or in the afternoon, that is an incredibly congested traffic corner. And it just seems not the best choice for us to put yet another school in a space where we've currently got a high school and the middle high and an elementary school in a very close proximity, all using that thoroughfare.
Well, having lived in that area now for almost 12 years, I can say, and go to the Y very frequently, which is right across the other side of Carmichael. They added some turn lanes since the middle school was built, and it still hasn't really helped much at all.
Very congested.
Certainly, we would expect that there would be road improvements if we would put any school on that site.
Who pays for those?
School district, certainly. We may share that with the city. At Rivercrest, we certainly had costs because of the road improvements. But if we look at that and think of our projections to the future, if we look at K-12, we could have 4 schools within a mile of each other and 4,000 students. That's very significant in a very mostly residential area.
Okay, and you're talking because it would be 6 through 12, all of those grades, plus one of the elementary schools
Yes.
being close by. Okay, so we've talked about some of the advantages, disadvantages of these different options. Talk again, and let's end because we've gone a little bit over, but that's okay because we're trying to move it along. But with regard to the St. Croix Meadows site, and there's another overhead that I want to focus on, and that is obviously you you buy land to put a building on it, ostensibly. All right, and in this case, that's the goal here, and to do it in relatively short fashion. It's not decided exactly what that building would be. You want to have the flexibility for the community to decide whether it'll be a 4-year, a 3-year, or a 2-year institution.
And this property certainly gives us that flexibility.
And even if it was as small as a 2-year, because it sounds like if you're only accommodating 2 grades on 120 some acres, that seems like a lot of extra space. But unlike the spaces that we do have now, the middle school and the high school, as far as being easily expandable. Right. And before I moved to that St. Croix Meadows, I wanted to touch on that because the do nothing. There's a segment of the population when it comes to referendums, they just prefer to do nothing, just say no. Mm-hmm. If we do nothing about buy and purchase further land and just hold on to the UU property and make the best of it or whatever, what happens at the high school level, is that land that we have, what the high school sits on now, is it expandable? I mean, you've already connected and put in an auditorium. You kicked out grades 7 and 8 and added it to a middle school. You've kicked out the administration building. Doing nothing currently continues the cost of having the administration building, which you already have, which if we didn't need that administration building, that would be an asset that could be sold by the school district, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so focusing on just the current high school, expandability at 1,600, where are we at 1,635 current enrollment to the top of these projections in the foreseeable future anyway, within the demographers' projections of 2220. That's 600, doing very quick math, it's about 32% projection increase. All right, can you expand the size and square footage of that building?
So the short answer is you might be able to put a second story on, but you don't have any way to service that extra population in terms of the common spaces and also in terms of the surrounding area. If you think about the parking, we already have students that park daily over at St. Patrick's Church, and candidly we have students that park on some of the side roads when nobody's looking, because we're constrained that we have limited field space for things that happen outside of the physical school building. So the answer is no, it's a 43-acre site.
43 acres, and if we look at our current population right now, the minimum usable acreage should be 57.
Okay.
So could we add to it? Yes, we could. Should we add to it is the question. We already don't have enough parking for our current population, as Barb just said. If we put another structure or more structure on that site, we're taking up the green space, we're taking up parking space, and we can't serve the population that's in the building. And then you have to think of as well, what's the impact on the surrounding community to bring 2,000 or more students to that one site?
Again,
And
already
that's very significant.
Okay, so let's just recap where we went before we then end with these the features of the financials of getting it into a position where we could put a building on St. Croix Meadows. Okay, you've got a middle school, that's the largest middle school in the state, and 200 students over capacity.
Correct.
Almost 200 students. It will be in a couple years, that many, and then some. All right, so a middle school that needs a solution soon. You've got a UU property that cannot house a 4-year high school.
Correct.
With the projections that we have. We have a current 4-year high school that cannot house 2,200 students and cannot be expanded to that, to accommodate that. And any potential of Carmichael and Vine being an obvious, because it's so visible as an option, would not house a 4-year school of 2,500 students. So that leaves us with St. Croix Meadows as being the option then that could accommodate up to a 4-year. But what you're not doing with this referendum is dictating to the residents and to the taxpayers, you have to put a $100 million high school on that property.
That's correct.
Okay. And so the idea being the flexibility, if the school district were to choose to retain the current high school and just eliminate one of the grades, that would alleviate some of these future projected overcrowding. Same thing with the middle school, by taking one of those grades out, that could, or there's lots of options anyway.
Lots of options.
And we have to look for flexibility in
And
those
so
options.
flexibility is with the St. Croix Meadows. Now, cost-wise, that's what we want to try to get it to apples and apples. You've got it already it's got city sewer and water to the site already with the dog track that was there.
To the actual structure, so, yes.
And then you've got a structure there, and I think we've got that graphic. I want to make sure that our text can put that up. Thank you. We have an existing facility that is about 90,000 square feet that would be still usable for the new facility, whether that's a 2-year, a 4-year, a 3-year building. And that would be a savings of somewhere between 4.5 and 6.75. Am I reading that?
Yeah, and that's just for the structure itself. So there are other savings based on infrastructure that exists on that property. So if you take what we would anticipate saving by reusing components that are on that property, it's components of the structure. It's also existing ponds, it's the water main piping, it's also the asphalt, a huge parking lot out there. And as importantly, there is the entryways that are designed for high volume traffic that we don't have to construct by virtue of purchasing a property where that exists.
Now I see a couple numbers here in parentheses. What does that mean?
Those are costs that we would incur as a function of buying the St. Croix Meadows property. Certainly there will be some demolition of existing structures.
Okay, so that would be a disadvantage financially to this compared to a UU site or even the Carmichael and Vinci that doesn't have a building on it to demolish.
Sure, but important to note that the cost of the demolition work that would be required with the St. Croix Meadows property is fractional compared to the savings that we will gain with the ability to reuse
So
the
these
existing structure.
numbers that are in the bold in the bottom,
Yes.
that's a net. So
That is
that's
a
even
net.
including those numbers in parentheses that range from, I'm doing quick math, 770,000 to nearly $1 million. Even with those deductions for either
Yes.
complete or partial demolition, you're still saving 4.8 to 7.45, which would be a number before you start construction.
That's correct.
To put it into a comparison then of the net cost. So if you're paying 8.25 for this property and it comes with these different advantages of structures and piping and so forth, then the net cost, I mean the taxpayers still have to pay the 8.25 on the bond.
Correct.
But the net cost would be somewhere between 3.4 and 1 million. And that's not, then that puts us in the position of ready to build more onto it. Doesn't include any cost of adding to the facility.
That's exactly right.
And if we looked at those numbers, when they were prepared, they are at 50% of the cost. They're very conservative numbers. And we anticipate that they could even be higher than the numbers that you see on this.
So if you were to put in 5,460 linear feet of water main piping, whether it be at a Carmichael site or at a UU site, it would cost twice what the estimates are here. They've used numbers that were only 50% to account for the fact that those infrastructure improvements have been there for 20 years.
Yes.
Okay. Now, in addition to having the flexibility of the size of the facility and some cost savings that the taxpayers have to understand, there's a net cost to this to get it in the position of being able to build on it. Okay. So, in addition to that, what about this notion of the administration building could be moved there? Is that right?
Yes.
So that's another savings?
Well, it might be moved to that site, but it also might be moved back to the high school, the current high school. You know, if we move students out of that high school and there is room there, that would be a place for the administration to go back to. So we would look at all of our buildings and see how do we use them. We plan to use all of our buildings. And if we can put the administration building for sale, we said that when we purchased it. We said if there's a time that there's space in the district for the administration building, we would put the current building that we have for sale at that time.
Building, whether it's a 2-year or 3-year,
Correct.
at the dog track, also doesn't preclude expanding that facility at a later date if that was decided by the community to be a place for a 4-year.
Yes. Yes, that's exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So flexibility, is there any points that I failed to hit from the outline that we had kind of discussed? Because
You know,
I know we're very compressed for time, so that's why I
I
want to get
think
to
one
your
of
point.
the issues that we've heard, questions we've heard about, is the purchase price of the property. Barb, maybe you
Oh,
can
the
speak to
actual
that.
value. And you're right, because I know
Why
that...
is it different than the appraised value?
Yeah, well, the assessed value, I've seen letters to the editor saying, you know,
Yes.
that this school board, and you're the president of it, you know, needs their head examined to offer to pay $8.25 million for a property that the tax statement says is only $5.01 million.
Correct.
And I just want to, that is the assessed value as opposed to the appraised value.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
So, so the answer to that is, we understand, and I think most people would understand, that the assessed value on the tax statement often is divergent from the actual fair market value of the property. One of the things that we know is that there recently was a 64-acre parcel that was sold in the business park, and when you look at the comparisons, that piece of property sold, if you look at it on a per square foot basis, that piece of property sold for over $2 a square foot, just as raw land.
Raw land, that's without structures and the improvements, okay.
And that sale price was the sale price and the development costs. And it was $2.25 per square foot.
Per square foot. So the dog track, when you look at that parcel on a per square foot basis, it's $1.50 per square foot. At $8.25 million, it's $1.50 per square foot. And we have potentially from $5 million to $7.5 million worth of structural value already sitting there. So
built into that $1.50 per square foot
Yes.
price.
Yes.
Well, but again, have you actually done the appraisal on this property? Is it in the process? I mean, most people aren't going to buy $1 million plus property without having it appraised to get an idea, especially in the market. We've had a paucity of real estate movement, so we don't know necessarily, although you point out the one comparable in the business district, business park that's not that far away.
Correct.
So when is this appraisal going to come in?
The appraisal is underway. I think the board expects to hear some specifics on the outcome of that appraisal at one of the next couple of board meetings that
Actually,
we have.
at the February 14th it's scheduled.
All right, so in a week we'll know.
Okay, very good. Is there any other points that we haven't addressed? I think that, thank you for reminding me about the value, because I think that that is important. I mean, taxpayers want to know you're wisely spending their dollars. And they're not certain whether this school district just wants to go out and buy land for twice what it's worth or twice what it's assessed at. But
I think there's concern in our community about what next and how much does that cost. And we do have good news in relationship to that. The graph that you showed about the debt.
okay, the debt referendum payments that we are currently under from past referendums.
Absolutely, and then adding on the purchase of the dog track. If we look at that, that graph, the lines decrease over time, and that's
Right.
retirement of debt.
And so there's the past debt or current debt, even if this referendum didn't get passed, would be done in the year, it looks like 2027, something like that.
Something like that, yes.
So if we just took a dotted line and took the added cost of the dog track purchasing the site, and we took that dotted line all the way across, there is capacity here for us to put into the purchase of, or the construction of the building that is a great advantage to our taxpayers. And what we've estimated now is that capacity is we could fund approximately, with certain assumptions, at the same level of what our taxpayers are currently paying for this debt, about up to $40 million of cost of the construction of a secondary school.
Okay, and $40 million, give us some idea, because elementary schools cost much differently than secondary schools. What would that, is that roughly the equivalent of a basic 2-year facility, or is that?
I don't have that specific information.
Right.
It depends on what we choose to put in that facility.
And again, that's the part of the flexibility that you want to be able to give the taxpayers and the voters of this district, is rather than lock them into a 2-year, 3-year, or 4-year option, which choosing to build on some of these other properties we've mentioned would lock in your options for buildings on those properties. You would have then
Because of the
flexibility.
limitations. Mhm.
Yes, okay. Well, thank you again for being on the show. I appreciate it. It was very informative. I hope our viewers got something out of it. And the point being, though, that they should be, this is an evolving issue because you're getting information. As we're taping this now, by the time this gets aired, we may have that appraisal in. Is there a place they could go to get more information about the purchase?
There is. The district is actually trying to update the district website. There is a frequently asked questions page specifically around the referendum and the purchase issues. So I would encourage people to go to the Hudson School District website and look for that FAQ section.
Okay. And just Google Hudson School District and you'll be able to get the general page and navigate from there. Okay.
Or www.hudson.k12.wi.us.
Thank you. That's what I needed. All right. Thanks a lot for being on the
Thanks,
show.
Jamie.
And
Thanks, Jamie.
we will find out what the voters choose in early April. And thank you again for joining us for another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal.